think we can get going. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of Connecticut's Affordable Housing Conference. My name is Kaylee Pratt. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Partnership for Strong Communities, and very excited to be here with you this morning and this wonderful panel for the Fair Rent Commission session this morning. So before we get to the session, I just want to note for those who are just joining us, welcome. And those who joined us yesterday, thank you for coming back. We hope that yesterday's sessions were engaging and informative, and we hope to continue to provide those types of sessions for the next 2 days. So thank you. As you know, this Connecticut's Affordable Housing Conference features local, state, and national experts that lead conversations that explore challenges, share best practices, and coalesce us around critical next steps to address key affordable housing issues in our state. This year, the conference is focused on building stability, and each session spotlights a unique approach to strengthening housing stability for households and communities across Connecticut. You can join the conversation at hashtag CAHC 2022 on Twitter. And if you're not already following us, you can find us at CAHC Housing. Slide. As I mentioned, today's session is the Fair Rent Commission session. But first I want to show you a few, or want to mention a few conference agenda points for today. So we have sessions this morning from 9 to 12:30, and then from 12:30 to 1:30, we'll have our plenary Ensuring Equitable Restoration for Communities of Color. Hoping you can all join us for that. And then we go back into session from 1:30 to 4 p.m. And then following that is an in-person conference networking reception. Go on to the next. Great. So before we jump in, just wanted to thank our leading sponsors, the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, Connecticut Department of Housing, La Rosa Building Group, Melville Charitable Trust, and Wells Fargo. Their deep support has allowed us to have this conference once again this year. And our collaborating sponsors, you can see them on the screen here: Bank of America, Harvard Foundation for Public Giving, KeyBank, Webster, and Rockford Mortgage. We have a lot of supporting sponsors that have helped make this conference possible. So thank you to all of them as well. And last but not least, we have our session sponsor, Navigate Affordable Housing Partners. I just also want to bring your attention to the tenant-based subsidies in Connecticut Equitable Expansion I-Forum. Registration is now open for this event. We will be hosting it on Tuesday, December 6th. That event will feature an overview of tenant-based housing subsidy programs in Connecticut, who accesses those programs, and the deep positive impact those housing subsidies have on households' lives and quality of life. And I will put a link to that registration in the chat once I hand it over. So just a couple more things and then I'll hand it over. Housekeeping items before we get started. Everyone has entered the meeting muted, and you will remain on mute throughout the entire event unless one of the speakers asks you to come off of mute. We ask you to please remain on mute. The session is being recorded, and we will make all the recordings available as soon as possible following the event. If you have a technology issue, please go to the chat icon at the bottom of your screen and send a direct message to me, or forgot to mention my co-host this morning is Danielle Hubbley, our education and collective impact, education and advocacy manager. Apologies. So either send a tech question to me or her, and we would be happy to get back to you as quickly as possible. And after the session, you can complete a session feedback survey by clicking on the megaphone icon in the conference lobby, and we would love to hear your feedback. So with that, I will hand it over to Sarah White from Connecticut Fair Housing Center.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah White. I'm an attorney at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center, and welcome to this session, Introducing Fair Rent Commissions in Connecticut. What we're going to do today is I'm first going to give a brief overview of what fair rent commissions are, how they work, how they make decisions. Then we're going to move into a panel discussion about fair rent commissions and then open it up to the audience for questions. In terms of questions, to keep things manageable, if you want to just add them in the chat as we go along, and Kaylee and I will keep track of them, and then when we reach our question portion, come back to them. All right, if you just give me a second to share my screen. So an introduction to fair rent commissions in Connecticut. What are fair rent commissions? I'm sure folks have a lot of questions about this. So as people may know, rent control is not currently allowed in Connecticut, but for more than 50 years, we have had this tool called fair rent commissions that can provide some rent stabilization to existing tenants. Connecticut towns and cities have been permitted to set up fair rent commissions for around 50 years, but it hasn't been required. Fair rent commissions can lower excessive rent that's harsh and unconscionable, that's the language used in the law, following a tenant's complaint in a hearing. Commissioners are unpaid town residents who are appointed by the local government, and their decisions are guided by factors in the state law. A big change in the law around fair rent commissions, though, is as of last legislative session, a bill was passed requiring cities and towns that have populations of 25,000 or more to set up fair rent commissions. And those ordinances need to be passed by July 2023. So while this has been optional in the past in around 24 cities and towns, all the way from big cities like Hartford and New Haven to very small towns have had fair rent commissions, now around 24 more will need to create them. And as we've seen, really steep increases in rent in Connecticut, we've seen estimates of 20% rent increases over the last year or so. Fair rent commissions, which had been fairly dormant in some towns and cities, are newly activated, getting a lot more complaints, and an important tool for tenants who are being priced out of their apartments by rising rents overall. So what are fair rent commissions for? As I mentioned, they provide rent stabilization to tenants who already live in an apartment based on tenant complaints. So rent stabilization meaning a way to limit increasing rent so people aren't priced out or forced out. And they can accept complaints based on an unfair rent increase, but also, bad conditions in an apartment or a reduction in services. So even if there isn't a rent increase, if a tenant feels that they're not getting what they paid for or should be getting because there are, rats, roaches, mold, like leaks, whatever, or, a reduction in what they were getting. So something we see a lot is like broken elevators. Then a tenant can also file a complaint with the Fair Rent Commission to ask that their rent be lowered, even if there wasn't a rent increase. And then third, Fair Rent Commissions can accept complaints about landlord retaliation. So that could be, a landlord raising rent after someone complains to the Fair Rent Commission, complains to housing codes, forms a tenant union, things like that. This also gives tenants, a way to seek relief from that as well. Under state law, any tenant can complain to a Fair Rent Commission unless they live in a seasonal rental. So it covers mobile home park residents that rent their lot, all sorts of tenants, all sizes of buildings. Even if they get Section 8, it really covers most of the market. And the way the process generally looks, which will vary by commission, is the tenant complains, usually on a fairly simple form. There's often an attempt at informal conciliation where whoever's staffing the Fair Rent Commission for the municipality, talks to the landlord, talks to the tenant, sees that there's a way to work it out, perhaps with lowered rent for a period of time or a correction, repairing bad conditions. There may be an investigation by the town, which could look like, sending out someone from housing codes or the health department to look at conditions, or the fire marshal, things like that. And then there's a hearing in front of the commission, and then the commission makes a decision about whether rent should be lowered or what other forms of relief should happen. Fair Rent Commission decisions, they have a lot of flexibility to sort of come up with remedies that work for the tenant and for the situation. So it could look like, no rent increase, a delayed or staggered rent increase. So going up a little bit over 6 months and then a little bit more 6 months later to give tenants more of a cushion. It could be a rent reduction, especially if there are bad conditions or the tenant isn't getting what they originally paid for. They also have the power to lower or even escrow rent until repairs are made, which can give tenants a really important tool to seek relief from unsafe conditions in their apartment. They can allow the rent increase to go forward. They don't have to side for the tenant. And they can also order the landlord to cease retaliatory conduct, which could include ordering a landlord to cease pursuing an eviction against someone or withdraw a notice to quit. And then in terms of what sort of guides Fair Rent Commission's decision, the state law lists the factors for commissioners to look at, but not all have to be considered or given equal weight. And the Fair Rent Commission, also has authority to consider other things. And there are 13 factors laid out in the law, and we've sort of grouped the main ones together because some of them are fairly similar. So the main factors are the size and history of the rent increases, what the landlord's operating costs are. So how much of the rent increase is to cover, repairs, increases in prices around heating, things like that, and how much is just sort of going to profit. The tenant's income and the availability of alternative housing. And this is important because, as I mentioned, this is a rent stabilization measure to prevent displacement. And so if tenant has nowhere else to go, is not going to be afforded somewhere else, that's something the commission can take into account in keeping rent lower. The condition of the apartment in the complex, including whether it's substandard, what's included in the rent, and then also comparable net rents in the neighborhood and town. So I won't go through all the list, but this is towns with Fair Rent Commission ordinances and towns that will need to pass them by this July. The one with asterisks are Fair Rent Commission or towns where there's an ordinance on the book, but we don't believe the Fair Rent Commission is in operation right now. So most of those will need to get those up and going again. But as you can see, many of our larger cities at this point don't have Fair Rent Commissions, including Waterbury and Middletown. And so we'll need to set them up, as well as, suburban towns as well. And then we'll come back to these at the end and share them in the chat, but we do have some resources and are working on more for towns that are setting up Fair Rent Commissions. We've worked on a toolkit that's intended for municipalities on Fair Rent Commissions in Connecticut, which includes a model ordinance that towns can adopt, annotations to that ordinance explaining why. We're suggesting these based on state law and also practice among existing Fair Rent Commissions, more information, some FAQs about Fair Rent Commissions. Rafi and myself are also offering free technical assistance for municipalities setting up Fair Rent Commissions or reviving them, as well as community members who want to push their town to create a strong Fair Rent Commission. And we're working on planning a training, a longer training for municipalities in early 2023, which will dive into more of the specifics about how to set up Fair Rent Commissions, how to train commissioners, what processes need to be in place. And if you're interested in staying in touch with us about Fair Rent Commissions, learning about that workshop for municipalities or a possible one in the future for tenants and community members, we have a Google form so we can just get your email and more information, which we'll also put in the chat and share at the end. So now I'm going to introduce our panelists as we move into our panel discussion and then our Q&A. So today we're joined by Wodalise Bermudez, who is the Executive Director of the New Haven Fair Rent Commission, Rafi Podolsky, who's an attorney at Connecticut Legal Services, and Paul Boudreau, who's a leader in the Saramonte Tenants Union in Hamden, which has over 200 members at this point. So we're just going to start by, with our panel by, having everyone introduce themselves and, briefly share their experience with fair rent commissions. So you can get a sense of who our panelists are. And I'll start with you, Wildelise.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Wildelise Bermudez. I'm the Executive Director for the Fair Rent Commission for the City of New Haven. And prior to this role, I worked in the nonprofit sector, and I also served as a elected municipal legislator for 6 years in our capital city. One of the things that I quickly realized as soon as the pandemic hit as a legislator was that the leading issue within our communities was housing, and it continued to be that and continues to be so for a variety of reasons. And so around over 10 months ago, I was approached to see if I would consider being in this position as the Executive Director for the Fair Rent Commission. And I am here. I've been in this role now for 9 months, and I'm really excited to work on these issues with my colleagues.
Thank you, Wildelise. And then I'll pass it to Rafi to introduce himself.
I'm Rafi Podolsky. I'm a lawyer with Connecticut Legal Services. In that capacity, I've been the legislative advocate on housing matters for the legal aid programs in Connecticut for many years. I have my own personal experience with fair rent commissions going way back into the 1980s. When I was a member of the Hartford Fair Rent Commission, I also did some research back then. I actually pulled up some of that research to see how many complaints back in those times the commissions were getting. The big commissions were Hartford, New Haven, and Stamford, and they were actually receiving over 200 complaints per year and handling those cases. And they really developed how those matters could be handled in an efficient way. And one of the interesting things that came out of that study from back then was nearly all of the decisions of fair rent commissions were unanimous. And the solutions the commissions came up with were very pragmatic. In any event, I've been interested in fair rent commissions over a long period of time, and I really welcome the opportunity to share whatever I can with everybody today.
Thank you, Rafi. Paul, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Paul Boudreau. I'm one of the leaders for the STU Hamden Tenants Union, as well as one of the co-founders. Basically born into organizing and politics. My family's been heavily involved in politics as well as like actual labor union organizing. I went to school for politics at NYU, but I'm a mechanic. And my real experience has been with organizing the tenants unions and eventually moving into fair rent commissions, housing, and all the other branches of housing justice.
Thank you, Paul. So I'm going to start with some questions for our panelists, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. So if you have questions about fair rent commissions, be sure to put them in the chat, and we'll come to them in a second. So Wildelise, I'm going to start with you. Could you give us examples of fair rent commission complaints you've seen and what the process looked like and the resolution was?
Yeah, so I'll first start off with the process. So when we receive a complaint, and in your slide, you pretty much summarize the types of complaints that we receive. So either unsafe, unhealthy housing conditions, or a tenant files a complaint because they have a proposed rental increase from the landlord. Also, sometimes we have that other category. An example I'll use for today was during the summer. You all remember there were several weeks that it was excruciatingly hot outside. And so we had a tenant file a complaint in the other category where she did not have AC, and AC was in her contract, in her lease. And so when we receive these complaints, we investigate them. We operate with a staff of 2 in the Fair Rent Commission in the City of New Haven, so myself and our field representative. Not all commissions have that, but you don't necessarily have to have that. Every town's a little different in terms of what's available. And we also have our commissioners who are volunteers, and we meet once a month to review the cases. During our investigation period, we gather information. So whether it's pay stubs or, if the tenant is part of a protected class, we would need that as evidence, if they're disabled or elderly, for instance. We also gather information from the landlord as well. For example, we request that the landlord submit a landlord income expense statement to the commission. So it's a fact-finding process that we have during our investigation. We then have an informal hearing with myself and the parties, the landlord and the tenant, to try to see if there could be some kind of negotiation, if they could meet somewhere to agree on what is being proposed, if there is some kind of negotiation that would be amenable by the parties. If that does not occur, then we send the case over to a public hearing before our Board of Commissioners. In New Haven, we can have up to 9 commissioners. We currently have 5 commissioners, and the commissioners are a diverse group of people comprised of tenants and as well as landlords. And very diverse backgrounds ethnically, and also diverse backgrounds in terms of what they do professionally. And it is ultimately, when we have a public hearing, we as the staff provide the commissioners with all of the information that we've collected from the parties and present our findings, and also the commissioners hear direct testimony from the parties, from the tenant and the landlord. And during that process, the commissioners get to decide and ultimately rule on the case. And during the ruling of the commissioners, whatever the commissioners rule, however they decide the case will go, it will stand for up to a year. The types of cases that we get are a variety of cases. I've kind of given you a perspective of the 3 types of main cases that we receive: unsafe, unhealthy, in a proposed rental increase. Sometimes it's a combination of those 2 together, and sometimes it's that other category where there is an explicit language on the lease, and that is not being it's not something that's being offered to the tenant, even though it's on their lease. And so, but we also receive a variety of complaints, not just those 3 categories, but a variety of complaints from different types of people in our community. So we receive complaints from different groups in different socioeconomic arenas. And so we have folks who are working class, folks who are middle class. We have people who are very young. We have people who are middle aged. We have people who are elderly. So we receive a variety of complaints from different populations who are New Haven residents. Sometimes we even receive complaints outside of our jurisdiction from different neighboring towns, but obviously we can only operate within the city of New Haven. So each Fair Rent Commission can operate within their own municipal, their own town or municipality. And so the kinds of complaints specifically, and I've pulled up a couple just to give you some perspective. We had a case come before us where the tenant had complained for over a year to the landlord, a problem with raccoon infestation. The raccoons were creating holes in the walls, and it was really a nuisance for them. And it was in the attic, and so over a year of complaints. And the tenant called LCI, so that's our Livable City Initiative, so it would be the equivalent of a housing inspector or housing department in another town. So the case was open with them for some time as well. They came to us in the Fair Rent Commission. We went through the process. The Fair Rent Commissioners ruled to reduce the tenant's rent in half until all of the repairs were made, until the re-inspection from LCI came back as completely passing, and until the commissioners themselves ruled on the case. So that case actually took several months. It took over 6 months. So that's one case. Another case of unsafe, unhealthy condition was a case where the tenant had an inoperable stove, and they also had a rodent infestation, and their rent was reduced to half. Also similar scenario where the rent would be returned back to the same price that they've been renting it out to, so long as the repairs were made, the reinspection passed, and the commissioners ruled through the public hearing process. What was interesting about that particular case was during the public hearing process, the landlord informed the commission that, by the way, they were going to increase the rent. which actually they could not do. We referenced state statute 47A-20, and they did not know. And so it was interesting to see that come up because it was originally, the case was only an unsafe and unhealthy housing condition case. It was not an excessive rental increase, but then it turned into an excessive rental increase literally right in front of the public hearing before the commissioners. Another case that we had, this one was involving a proposed rental increase. This was a couple who had a 2-bedroom apartment. They had one son who worked full-time, who was in his mid-30s, and they filed a complaint for unsafe, unhealthy housing conditions along with an excessive rental increase. They had been paying $775 for their apartment, and they've been living there for over 20 years, and the increase was to $925. And so during the course of the complaint process, after several informal hearings, as well as several public hearings, 2 public hearings for this case, the landlord was actually able to put in a new, a completely new, let me just go back. They were able to redo their roof. So they put in a new roof. They also put in new windows, or completely new windows for the entire unit. They repaired the bathroom. They fixed the floors in the kitchen that needed to be fixed. And so there were basically all of the repairs were done in that case. And so the commission ruled in favor of the proposed rental increase of $925 for that 2-bedroom. And I'm giving you just different examples, but obviously there are particularities within each case based on the 13 set of criteria that Sarah mentioned earlier. And so that also, I'm giving you the very abridged version of these cases, but there's a lot of details that go on with each case. Another example of a proposed rental increase, this was a proposed rental increase in a townhouse, 3-bedroom townhouse. The proposal was originally for $1,100, 2 adults, so mom and dad, several children, and it would have been a 36% rental increase. The commissioners ruled instead to have the rental increase be set at $150 for a rental increase. Another example that I'd like to give you, and I obviously want to hear from the other commissioners and the other folks that are on this panel. The proposed rental increase from a 3-bedroom apartment being rented by 3 working adults, so not family, and the tenants their rent would have gone from $900 to $1,200, a 33% increase for this 3-bedroom. And in that particular scenario, it was also a combined unsafe, unhealthy. The case was referred to us by our Louisville City, our housing inspectors. When all was said and done and the repairs were completed, the commission did rule in favor of increasing the amount to the $1,200 for the 3 adults who live there. There's been other cases as well where the commissioners have ruled in favor to have either reductions or increases. Some of the increases have been kind of like meeting halfway, but again, it all depends on the particularities of each case. So I will stop there.
Thank you so much. Rafi, could you share a little more about the purpose of history of fair rent commissions and maybe how they were used in the past?
Sure. The original Fair Rent Commission statute goes back to 1969. That actually followed a period in which during World War II there was actually rent control. Maybe it's just worth saying that rent control is a market regulatory approach to housing. That's to say, in order to have rent increases above a certain amount, they have to be approved. Fair rent commissions are very different. And in the 1950s, the state of Connecticut had ultimately allowed to sunset a statute that authorized towns to have fair rent commissions. And the Supreme Court ruled that essentially meant that without that statute, towns could not adopt them. Stamford and Hartford were two major towns that tried to find ways to maintain some form of rent stabilization. And ultimately, in 1969, the legislature authorized towns to do that. So that's kind of where the history comes from this. And so since then, fair rent commissions have been the vehicle, really, as a practical matter, well, certainly the primary vehicle for any kind of rent regulation in the private market. But it's this very narrow kind of regulation that's driven by individual complaints, and the burden is always on the tenant to raise the issues. So that's, and the over time, back roughly in the 1970s and 1980s, a bunch of towns created fair rent commissions, and those still exist. During, I would say, the last decade, the last 10 to 20 years, there was a relative amount of rent stability. And one of the things we discovered, we didn't really fully know this until recently, was that a number of the fair rent commissions became kind of semi-dormant. And what we've seen as rents have shot up in the past year, towns have reactivated their rent commissions because they were still on the books. Nobody repealed their ordinances. And that also led to the statute this year that really required larger towns to have commissions. One of the things that's worth knowing is, in general, landlord-tenant law in Connecticut is uniform. So every tenant in Connecticut has largely the same rights as every other tenant. And if there's certain categories that might have more rights. Seniors, in some cases, mobile home park residents, in other cases, it's still statewide. It doesn't matter where your apartment building is as a senior, the rules are going to be the same in each town. And that controls what your rights are as a tenant. And the unusual thing about fair rent commissions is that the right to challenge a rent increase by a tenant, in a sense, only exists in a town that has a fair rent commission. So it's an unusual case in which the substantive right of the tenant to dispute the increase only exists in those towns that chose to exercise their optional power to create a commission. And I think that's one of the things that motivated the legislature this past year to decide that at least in the towns that have a lot of tenants, there should be some vehicle by which a tenant could reasonably exercise that right. Now, it doesn't mean that the rent is limited, because commissions can decide anyway. I mean, this is a decision. Commissions do not necessarily rule in favor of the tenant, or there are these many compromise decisions in which rent increases are approved after certain conditions are met. But that has greatly increased, or will increase in due course, the number of tenants that will live in a town where they have a right to raise the issue. Once the statute is fully implemented, which means July of 2023, about somewhere between 3/4 and 4/5 of the tenants in Connecticut will be in a town that has a fair rent commission. The other thing that's interesting is that a number of smaller towns have adopted fair rent commissions. And some of that has been driven by mobile home parks. In Eastern Connecticut, there's several towns. With Westbrook has a fair rent commission. Killingworth just recently passed one. And in those towns, it's really been mobile home park residents who pushed the town voluntarily to take action. Those are not mandatory towns under the statute, because their population may be 6 or 8 or 9,000 people. But it reflects the fact that sort of this is not a big city versus small town mechanism. It's also interesting to note, if you look at the 24 towns that have ordinances, and going all the way back, you'd be shocked. I don't know if you had time to look at the list of towns that Sarah put up when she was speaking, but it's not what you think. For example, would you think that Glastonbury has a fair rent commission ordinance? Well, they do. So does Simsbury. So does Farmington. So it's not just New Haven and Stamford and Hartford, but it's a lot of suburban towns. Hamden has a fair rent commission. So and most of these fair rent commissions were not controversial. I mean, right now there's a lot of polarization and you get sharp differences in some towns. Killingworth, that was not really true. Killingworth has a Republican first selectman and 2 Democratic members of the Board of Selectmen. But certainly in the older commissions, they were pushed on a bipartisan basis. Sarah did a little bit of history, and it was interesting to see that historically the support for fair rent commissions was bipartisan. So hopefully that's the way towns will look at it as well, as they create commissions, that this will not be sort of an us versus them, but as a reasonable way to provide equitable relief that for tenants in place who are going to be driven out of their homes by what are essentially unfair or excessive rent increases. I don't know if that answers your question, Sarah.
That was great, Rafi. All right, Paul, I'm going to pass it to you. Just by way of background, Paul and the Serramonte Tenants Union have been involved in reviving Hamden's Fair Rent Commission, which had been dormant for years, and helping many tenants at Serramonte file complaints at the Hamden Fair Rent Commission about enormous rent increases they've been experiencing, other like bad conditions, and have actually been like representing each other at the hearings. So Paul, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, how the Serramonte Tenant Union and tenants in Hamden have used the Fair Rent Commission in your organizing, and kind of what it's been like from a tenant's perspective.
Hi everyone. So yeah, we've had a fair amount of experience now with fair rent and as a tenants union. I guess I should talk real quick about what a tenants union is first, for those of you who haven't really encountered it. Basically, it's 2 or more people in the same community that come together to bargain collectively and support each other. I mean, that's the really bare bones definition. Some people say it's in by the same landlord. We're officially citywide now. We're taking tenants from other complexes and other landlords. So we're a city union now. And what we do is basically, we've been helping people file fair rent commissions. If people have issues that are health department related, say like mold, rodents, that kind of thing, we help them file complaints to the health department, and pretty much help in any way we can. If that means helping you fill out a SNAP benefits application, then we'll do that, amongst like many other things. But our experience with the Fair Rent Commission has been very surprisingly positive as far as representing, collecting complaints, and also in helping the Fair Rent Commission process these things, because we can offer, so they can't track down a tenant. We usually know who they are. We can find them and get the information they need. If they need extra paperwork, we can usually get that submitted. And the big thing is that we can, we can file collectively in a way, like we can present evidence that's pertinent to all the tenants at, say, Serramonte, common areas, issues that are with the buildings themselves or the parking lots, so that the Fair Rent Commission doesn't have to hear that same evidence 7 times in a row because 7 tenants have filed the same similar complaints. So it has helped our Fair Rent Commission streamline the process, I think, greatly. Obviously, I don't know if some of you have seen some of the original hearings. They were kind of a train wreck at first, but it was a work in progress. And so in my view, I think we ironed out a lot of the difficulties very, very quickly. Like basically in a couple hearings, we ironed out most of the issues. And most of them were just procedural, to be honest. We have represented tenants. We get pushback from the other lawyers because we're not lawyers. But it's clearly stated in our ordinance that anybody can represent someone that they feel they want to represent them. So because of this, we know the procedure, we know the policies, we know the ordinance sometimes better than the commissioners and the lawyers, because we study it over and over. We know what to go to so that we don't have to spend 20 minutes trying to draw a picture where we can say, we've already offered this evidence in such and such way, with these pictures, you can look, refer to them again. And not everyone has the voice to fight for themselves. Not everyone has the ability to fight for themselves. Not everyone has a clear grasp on the language to fight for themselves necessarily. So it's good that we can all support each other. I think I'm trying to see if I missed anything in my notes. I think really the biggest advantage of encouraging tenant unions to help in the fair rent process is that we have resources as well. That a lot of, like, I live in Hamden right now. Hamden has I guess you'd call it a smallish town government in a lot of ways. And we've been able to assist with, like, even right down to writing statute. And I'm sure Rafi can attest to this about, legal aid helping. Like it turns the process into a community process instead of this isolated government thing that tends to roll over people. And it makes the process fair and workable. And like I said, we kind of ironed everything out in about a week and a half from the day, like the commission was put together to, to the, as far as like after the first hearing and stuff, like we really ironed things out quickly. And I don't think left to their own devices, the government can just do that on their own without the community's help.
Thank you, Paul. One
you're
more
welcome.
question for each of our panelists, and then we'll open it up to some of the audience questions. What should towns know or keep in mind if they're setting up a new fair rent commission or reviving a dormant one? And Wildelise, I'll start with you.
So, New Haven is very interesting in that we have, as I mentioned before, a staff of 2, myself and our field representative, but not every town needs to have that structure. So have a structure that works for your town. We're a city, we have a lot of complaints. And so that's what we've had now for many decades, and it's worked for New Haven in this way. As different municipalities are trying to set up their own structure, you can have a structure where maybe you assign a staffer to help in the way that, we do investigations and to gather that information. That's another structure that you could have, or you can have alternatively volunteers. And we do also have volunteers, as I mentioned earlier, that are commissioners, just like any other board and commission, appointed by the mayor, selected by the Board of Alders, to really help with the rulings and how the cases are gonna be. So it's up to the community, to decide what best works for you.
Rafi?
In order to have a commission, you need to have an ordinance. So maybe that's the first thing, is you have to, for a town that doesn't have an ordinance, you have to adopt one. Sarah mentioned that there's a toolkit available that we pulled together that essentially provides a sample ordinance. Every town's ordinance is a little bit different. There's some that are very brief, maybe a page and a half. There's some that are much more complicated and put the details of the procedures, how the hearings will be held. Those can be put into an ordinance. So the town needs to have an ordinance. It then needs to have commissioners. Ordinances typically dictate what the nature of the commissioners will be. The number of commissioners typically would be somewhere between either 5 or 7 are most common. Some of the larger commissions have 9. you just kind of assume you're gonna have an odd number, just in case that makes a difference. Some commissions have leave it open as to whether there's any kind of a balancing structure between landlord and tenant commission members. Some are very specific. For example, a 5-member commission might have, the ordinance might say 1 landlord, 1 tenant, 3 people who are neither landlord nor tenant. That's to say, really a homeowner who is not a landlord. Some may have a minimum number of landlords and tenants. The ordinances vary, and the appointing authorities will then work within that framework. Commissions are like any other lay entity within a municipality. They're made up typically of people who live in the town, but they have the same kind of powers that other commissions have. They're not a study commission, even though they can do studies. Their decisions are binding. I mean, it's like a zoning commission at some level, that if they make a decision, the decision's enforceable. So a town, I think a town coming to this from scratch, there are resources, and we're trying to make some, we ourselves are available to try and help those towns figure out how to put an appropriate ordinance together. Most towns, New Haven's unusual in having what I would call dedicated staff. That's to say, people who are essentially hired to be staff to a fair rent commission. Almost all the other towns that have commissions use someone who is already on staff, or entities that already exist. They take advantage of their code enforcement agencies. That's how they would find out if what the conditions, like to have a neutral who can look at the conditions in the apartment. They might use their social services department or a fair housing officer or someone like that to assume the responsibilities of being kind of a part-time staffer to the Fair Rent Commission. Clearly, the more complaints you get, then the more there's some staff pressure. But one of the things that means is when a town is setting up a commission, it is not ordinarily facing a sort of a funding issue as to how many staffers are we going to hire and how much is it going to cost us, because the most likely situation is going to be they're going to pull some existing staffers into the process, and that's who will perform those functions. Okay, I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, but
you absolutely
I'll
did.
stop there.
Paul, what are some lessons learned from Hamden in restarting your commission that other towns should keep in mind?
I think the biggest part was getting everybody on board first and realizing that it was very important to do, and important to do now, and not just keep putting it off and just, get it running on July 21st or whatever. I can't remember what the date was next year. Like understand that there's an urgency to this, and that, people are suffering, people are being evicted, people are being the rent raised out of their apartments. The other thing was, we're working on modernizing our ordinance now, because it was written in the 70s. And we didn't really have a lot, we didn't have the technology we have, we didn't have the infrastructure we have. Like, there's a lot of things now that are in place that the fair rent, the old ordinance just doesn't deal with in any way, because it wasn't there to deal with back in the day. And if you're writing one from scratch, I mean, there's plenty of people who are doing the same thing. I mean, I don't see why not collaborate. Look at what we're doing in Hamden, like Middletown's writing one right now. And we'll probably have theirs up and running fairly soon, I'm hoping. And there's a lot of good example, but find what works best for your place, for your town, your city, and your situation, because every city is a little different.
So I'm going to move to some audience questions now. How do residents of a community find out about the existence and the role of fair rent commissions? Whoever wants to sort of chime in on that.
So for us, it's on our city website, newhavenct.gov. But beyond that, since I assumed this role as executive director, one of the things that I noted was very important was to get the word out. So to meet the community where they're at. And so we've attended, for instance, family events put together by the youth and recreation department during the summer. I've also given workshops at the library branches in New Haven. Recently, and last month in October, I teamed up with a nonprofit agency called Junta in New Haven alongside New Haven Legal Assistance to provide an all-day housing workshop to the community. And so really meeting people where they're at to inform them, hey, this is a resource that you have available to you, and here's what we do.
Anyone else want to chime in? Paul?
I'd say one of the biggest ways is just like, well, what we've been doing, because a lot of people don't know about it, is having rally, like we had a rally at City Hall. We've done a lot of press and a lot of canvassing. Like we just literally let people know that it exists, because most people we talk to don't know it's there. It's not something that, there's no billboards for it. There's no big ads in the paper for it. So the only way people really know that it's there to utilize is to tell them.
A few other questions, and I'll kind of group these together. Is there a regional option for fair rent commissions, especially for our smaller towns? What happens if a landlord or tenant disagrees? Can they appeal? And are fair rent commission decisions legally binding?
You want me to start on that?
Yes.
Well, the first question on can you have a regional commission? The answer is yes, it's right in the statute. There are no regional commissions at the present time. There never have been. It is very hard to get towns to work together. But and I think larger towns, and probably the towns over 25,000 are not particularly likely to go regionally. They're going to want to have control through their own membership. Although it could be, some may. It makes a lot of sense for smaller towns to 2 or 3 or 4 towns to get together. These would be towns for which fair rent commissions would be voluntary. But we haven't seen that. But it may be that with the model of more of the larger towns having commissions, that we'll start to see that. So the answer is yes, you can do regionally. Sarah, what was the second and the third questions? Can
people appeal? And
yes.
Are the decisions legally binding?
Okay, so I've already said the decisions are legally binding. A lot of the commissions, a lot of the decisions, as noted by Wildelise, will in fact be negotiated, and there actually won't be a formal decision from the commission because the parties will work out the disagreement before you get to the hearing stage. But if it goes to a hearing, Fair Rent Commission has a hearing, they make a decision, it's binding. Now, again, last one, Sarah?
Appeal.
Appeal. Both parties have a right to appeal. The state statute does not say how long you have to appeal. So typically, ordinances will actually include a provision. I would say typically between 10 days and 30 days. It depends on the town. And those appeals will go to whatever part of the court system handles housing cases. This would be the same courts, for example, that would hear an eviction. So in most of the state, there's a sort of a formal housing court structure, and that's where an appeal would go. In some of the more outlying areas, Eastern and Western Connecticut, it would go there is some portion of the court system that hears housing cases, and that's where it would go. Any party has a right to do that. So either the landlord or the tenant could appeal.
So I'm going to answer a couple questions really quickly that I saw in the chat. In terms of if there are any preconditions to file to the Fair Rent Commission, no, a tenant doesn't have to complain to codes or complain to their landlord. But of course, that's often a best first step, although tenants should always try to document that in writing or have a witness. People who are adjusted impacted, who have criminal records, can complain to the Fair Rent Commission, can be commissioners. And then the last question I'll ask folks before we sort of sum up the resources that are available is how can people get involved in starting a Fair Rent Commission in their town or city? whoever wants to answer that, or maybe everybody.
I would start off with saying, get in contact with your legislator for your town, your legislators and the mayor, and just say, hey, like, this is something that we need, and start the conversation there, and hold them accountable to setting up an actual and having an ordinance voted on, and so that it could be on the books.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to realize, because this requires an ordinance, it's your local government. It's not your state legislator. It's your local government, your town council, your board of selectmen, whatever is the local governing authority that has to take action. And a lot of people have no idea who those people are. So if you want to have a fair rent commission, it means you need to find out what is the structure of your local government and who are the people. Find someone, for example, find a member of the town council and bring it to their attention. And that may be the way something gets started.
I might want to add too, it's probably helpful to get some of your neighbors together with you. Because having 10 or 15 people show up at your, first selectman or mayor's door has a bigger impact, because they know that for every one of those, there's probably 10 more voters thinking the same thing. And like Rafi said, that these are local municipal politicians that deal with this, so they're also it's easy to get their attention, because 20 or 30 people are a lot of votes to a local politician, and a lot of people don't realize that. But I know we really couldn't get anyone's attention until we had at least 100 people, and I think it's changing now, because like the fair rent commissions obviously have to be in place by next summer. So you may need less people then, but it's always good to have some support behind you, and also not try to do it all yourself.
So thank you so much, everybody. So there are 2 links in the chat. One is the toolkit on fair rent commissions, which contains a model ordinance. And while this is more directed towards municipalities, I think it's also really helpful for community members who want to push their town or city to set up a strong fair rent commission. And we're working on developing more tools too, and working with cities and towns, and working with community members like Paul, like others across the state who are working on setting up fair rent commissions in their town. And there's also a link in the chat to a Google form to share your email and your interest in learning more about fair rent commissions. We are planning an event for early 2023 that would be more geared towards municipalities and commissioners about like the mechanics of setting up a fair rent commission, but are also interested in doing similar workshops for tenants and community members who want to learn more about fair rent commissions, how to use them, how to organize around them, like Paul has said. So please sign up on that link if you're interested in staying in touch with us. And Rafi and I don't want to volunteer Paul and Mobiles, but hopefully all of us are really excited about building a strong network of fair rent commissions across the state, letting tenants know about it, making these real tools that we can use to address rising rents, bad conditions by often corporate landlords. So reach out to us as well. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending the session. It was really great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.